All right, if you got your Bibles now, go ahead and open up to Matthew chapter 26. We've been in the book of Matthew for quite a while now, but we're getting close to the end. We got as far, there's 75 verses in Matthew chapter 26, so it's taking a minute, but we're getting there. And in last week's lesson, of course, as y'all that have been here know, Matthew chapter 26 starts out with the plot to arrest and to kill Jesus. That's been going on in the background as Jesus has spent some time, his last hours with his disciples, as they have had what we would deem the Lord's Supper. He initiated that practice with them. And again, tried to explain to them, look, I'm going to go, I'm going to be crucified. They didn't really understand even at this point, I don't think. And then, of course, he foretells the fact that Judas will betray him, and that's really where we covered mostly last week. Though Judas had walked with Jesus, though Judas had seen the miracles, though he had experienced all that the other disciples had experienced, at the end of the day, ultimately, Judas was only in it for what he could get out of it for himself, and he never really, and this is I think the heart of the matter, he never really loved Jesus. He never really understood or took him to be who he said he really was, which was the Son of God, in spite of all of that. And so, in contrast to that, as well as covering Judas last week, we also talked about the fact that Jesus also foretells Peter's denial. And Jesus speaks plainly with Peter and tells him, look, you're going to deny me. And Peter vehemently denies that. He said, Lord, I never would deny you. In fact, what did Peter say? He said, I'll be willing to go as far as to die. And even if I have to die, I still won't deny you. Jesus the whole time is telling him, you'll deny me. He said, in fact, before the cock crows in the morning, now this is the evening that Jesus will be arrested and tried, and the next day he'll be crucified. He tells Peter, he said, before tomorrow morning, not next week, not next year, before tomorrow morning, he says, you're going to deny me not just once, but 3 times. And I'm sure in the back of Peter's mind, he's like, there's no way I'll deny him. Well, we'll see how that turns out. I'm thinking Jesus knows better. And this, obviously, one of many, many places you could use to demonstrate this, but the truth is, the Lord knows us better than we know ourselves. Peter thought he knew himself. A lot of times you and I think we know ourselves. We think we know what we're about. We think we know who we are. We think we know what kind of internal fortitude we have and how we can react and how we can behave in certain situations, only to find ourselves sometimes completely out of our own control. And it happens. And so Peter is in that predicament here, and we'll cover really the heart of Peter's denial today. But this is the arrest of Jesus, and this is where we left off last week. As Jesus has gone now into the garden, we covered the part where Jesus prays, not my will, but your will be done, as he has the weight of what Jesus is going to have to do begins to settle in on him, and as he begins to really feel in his human emotions and in his human being side the weight of all that's going to happen in the next 12 to 24 hours. And of course, as we've mentioned before, and we'll cover it more particular as we get into chapter 27, I don't think it's even as much the physical pain that he knows he's going to have to go through as it is the spiritual pain and the wrath that God is going to pour out on him that he's looking at facing. And so as they come to arrest Jesus in the garden, and it's interesting that Judas brings a whole troop of people out to arrest Jesus, and it says that he that betrayed him, we covered this last week, this is just by way of introduction, but now he that betrayed him, this would have been Judas, gave him a sign saying, whomsoever I shall kiss, the same is he, hold him fast. And of course, Judas, we've all heard of the Judas kiss, the kiss of betrayal, the giving up of Jesus for the 30 pieces of silver. This is where that comes from. And it says that forthwith he, talking about Judas, came to Jesus and said, "Hail, Master," and kissed him on the cheek. And of course, that was a common greeting in that day. But that was the sign. And of course, in verse 50, Jesus said unto him, "Friend, where art thou come? Or wherefore art thou come? What's your business here?" Of course, Jesus had already told him to do whatever he was going to do. Jesus knew he was going to betray him. It wasn't a surprise to Jesus. Jesus knew when he chose Judas this was going to happen. That's just the truth. But it says, "Then came they and laid their hands on Jesus and took him." And of course they came to arrest Jesus. And it says, "But behold, one of them that was with Jesus," and of course from the other Gospels we know this is who? Peter, "that stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck a servant of the high priest." We know this to be Malchus from the other Gospels, "and smote off his ear." Now this was significant in the arrest process of Jesus, and it would have. Now think about this. It would have led to Peter's execution for attempting to kill one of the high priest's guards, had Jesus not done what he did in this whole scenario. But Jesus tells Peter, and again it doesn't say that it's Peter here, but we know it is from the other gospel accounts. Jesus said to him, "Put up again thy sword into its place, for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword." And this is important to mention here, because there are those that teach what I would term militant Christianity, meaning you either it's almost like Islam, you either convert or we'll make you convert. But that is not the message that Jesus taught. It's not the message of Christianity. We don't do physical and bodily harm to others in order to prove our point or to get the gospel message out. Again, this winds up in all sorts of areas. There used to be those that would attempt physical harm on those that were in charge of places like abortion clinics and stuff like that. Again, true Christians don't advocate any of that. Those people need the gospel. They don't need to be harmed physically. They need the gospel message. And Jesus here is telling Peter, he says, look, if this is the route you want to go, sooner or later, those that choose to use violence to prove their point wind up dying by way of violence. That's just the way it is. But he says that's not the way this works. And of course, you can put together the pieces from all of the Gospels and get a bigger picture of this, of what Jesus is trying to say here. But it's interesting in this account, and I think this is probably some of the more pertinent information on this encounter here, because this is again, there's a large group of the high priest guard that have come out to arrest Jesus and to take him by force. They were probably expecting a skirmish or a fight, for the reason that they brought so many with swords and staves, as it said here. Look at the words of Jesus to Peter in 53. And again, it shows Peter's mindset about this whole scenario. Because see, Peter is still, as we talked about last week, Peter is still trying to accomplish the work of God in the energy of the flesh. Peter here is drew his sword, and he's going to fight for Jesus. He's going to fight, and he's going to, in his mind, he's going to kill as many of these people as he possibly can and keep them and prevent them from taking Jesus. Because Peter has in his mind where this scenario needs to go. Jesus has already got this all under control. And it's important to remember, both here and in our lives as individuals, even when things to us are perceived to be out of control, God is still in perfect control. Yes, I understand they're going to physically take Jesus and arrest him and hold him. He's still in control. And this verse right here proves it better than just about any. It says in verse 53, as he's speaking to Peter, he says, Peter, put your sword up. This is not the way we're going to accomplish this. You don't even really, there's so much that could be said here to Peter. Peter, you are so far off base on what's even going on right now. Your perception of everything is so skewed you don't get it. But he says in verse 53, thinkest thou, or as we would term it, do you not understand? Do you not realize? Don't you see, Peter, that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then shall the Scriptures be fulfilled, that thus it must be? Jesus had told them, as has told them numerous times, I'm going to die. That's the purpose for me being here, is to be able to be the sacrifice for sin. They're still like, no. Kingdom. We want the kingdom. Jesus is like, you don't even understand what you need the most. You don't need the kingdom the most right now. You need salvation the most right now. And for us, it's the same way. Heaven's wonderful. It's wonderful to think about. But you better get salvation before you're worried about anything beyond that. And he's telling Peter here in layman's terms, as I can describe it here, he's saying, Peter, do you think, now again, we have to rewind back and think of all that Peter's seen. Peter watched as Jesus walked to him on the water in the middle of the ocean. Peter watched as Jesus raised the dead. Peter watched as Jesus created food out of nothing and fed 5,000, and then again on another occasion 4,000, and that was just the men. 20-something thousand people probably each time. Peter watched as Jesus healed leprosy, made the lame walk, made the blind see. Peter was on the mountain of transfiguration and saw Jesus transfigured into his glorified form as his holy and complete self there. And here's Peter pulling his sword out and going to fight for Jesus. Because in Peter's mind, Jesus isn't smart enough to defend himself. And Jesus is telling Peter, with all that in the back of your mind, Peter, think about this for a minute. Do you really think that if I wanted to, that I couldn't get out of this situation? That's ultimately what he's saying to Peter. He's like, think about it, Peter. I'm here because I want to be here. I'm here because I need to be here. I'm in this position because this is the position I'm supposed to be in. In Peter's mind, he's like, yeah, but this is out of control. You're fixing to go down a path, Jesus, that you can't come back from. And Jesus is like, I know. This is the path that was always meant to be. And so Jesus says to him, look, I could end this right now. It wouldn't even be hard. All I got to do is say the word, and it's over. It's done. But Peter, how? If I do that, if I save myself from what's fixing to happen to me, how are the Scriptures going to be fulfilled? How am I going to be the sacrifice for sin? Ultimately, and this is what Peter really fails to see in this, ultimately, Jesus is saying, Peter, how are you going to be saved if I don't do what I'm about to do? The disciples still didn't fully get their need for a sacrificial Savior to pay for their sin debt. Now they'll get it after all of these events, but just understand, this is where Peter is at in his mind. Does Peter love Jesus? I think he absolutely loves Jesus. I think his actions here prove it. And in fact, and if you go back to Peter's statement, and I got to hurry because y'all are taking way too long with these 4 verses, but if you go back to Peter's statement of, I'll be willing to die for you, technically speaking, when Peter pulled out his sword in front of 30 or 40 people with swords and staves themselves and goes to swinging, truth be told, he stood a pretty good chance of doing just that right there. Would it have done him any good? No. What Peter needed most was what all of us need the most, and that was what Jesus was fixing to do, which was to die for him so that he could be saved. And so just understand, that's what he's telling Peter. And maybe in the midst of all of this, Peter kind of gets his feelings hurt a little bit. Because after all, he was willing to die. He was willing to put his life on the line. And Jesus almost is like, quit. Stop doing that. Quit resisting what I'm telling you needs to happen. And so, as we see, and of course, again, you can fill in all of the details from the other Gospels. It doesn't even mention the fact here that Jesus reaches down, grabs this man's ear, and reattaches it. And I think it is only that stabilizes the whole situation and keeps all of the disciples from winding up dead, because after all, they would have had just cause to kill Peter and the others for what he had just attempted to do. But I think they were somewhat in awe of the fact that Jesus just put this man's ear back on. Now, not much is mentioned thereafter about this man named Malchus. I personally would like to think that after Jesus is raised from the dead, he puts all of this together and realizes we'll see when we get to heaven. I don't know, but just understand. Jesus tells him, he says, How do you think it's going to work, Peter, if we don't do what the Scripture says is supposed to be done? I am here, and this is what Peter never understood. I am here to carry out my Father's will. That's what I'm here for. That's why he prayed, not my will, but thy will be done. So, in that same hour, here in verse 55, said Jesus to the multitudes. Now again, you see, it's a very large group that came out to arrest Jesus. And he says, are you come out as against a thief with swords and staves for to take me? Again, they came out with a large group of armed men to take Jesus. No doubt, again, Judas had probably mentioned the fact that, he has the ability to do an awful lot of miraculous things. You might want to be prepared for that. But he says, I sat daily with you teaching in the temple, and you laid no hold on me. Meaning you didn't arrest me and this is what Jesus is saying. You didn't arrest me in front of the crowd after I healed somebody or after I did a miracle, because after all, that wouldn't have gone so well for you. Here we are in the middle of the night, in the dark, and your side is out here arresting me with nobody else here to defend me or anyone. And again, this is the plan all along. Jesus is just merely pointing out that this is a plot to do what they're about to do to him with no real just cause. They don't really have any reason to be doing what they're doing. But it says, but all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then the disciples, and look at this, what did they do? They forsook him and fled, all of them. All of the disciples run off into the darkness and leave Jesus there by himself as they arrest him. Now again, he's saying here that the scriptures might be fulfilled, and the Bible did foretell that when they smite the shepherd, the sheep of the flock will be scattered. They are fulfilling Scripture, whether they realize it or not. God knew exactly what was going to happen. And it says that they forsook him and fled. And then they that laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest. And this was the high priest at the time. And as it's been mentioned before, Annas was the high priest previously. And usually the high priest would die and then the next one would take over. But Rome had kind of set Annas down, and Caiaphas was now the high priest. Both of them were ultimately political pawns They liked power, and they liked the position enough that they made some inside deals with Rome, and they were kind of buddy with Rome throughout all of this. And so it was really kind of a political position rather than the real position of high priest that God had established back in the Old Testament, whereby they were the mediator for the nation of Israel with God. It had turned into more of a political position. And you can see that by the fact that they took him to the high priest where the scribes and the elders were assembled, and in another verse or two it's going to call it his palace. So apparently now all of a sudden the high priest has his own palace. Now that wasn't in Old Testament scripture. They were supposed to live and to serve in the temple, but now they're living in fine establishments that have been provided them by their political friends. Now we go back to Peter, and of course just understand, and again I invite you as always to read the scripture. You can look at all of the gospel accounts. All of them take a little different look and from a little bit different perspective when it comes to this. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving parts. This is a scenario that is playing out over the course of one night. And there's a lot of different aspects to it, and a lot of different things happen. So some of the gospels cover parts and others cover other parts. And this is Matthew's viewpoint as all of this is going on. And of course, understand Matthew has to write this, and when Matthew says that all the disciples fled, guess who's included in that? He was. He was part of the crowd that was running through the woods away as they arrested Jesus. But it says here in verse 58 that Peter followed him afar off. So apparently, and this again, this is kind of Peter's nature, Peter didn't run too far, because as they arrested Jesus and took him to Caiaphas, the high priest here, it calls him his palace, Peter kind of drifts back in. So he didn't run too far. But it says that he followed him afar off to the high priest's palace and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Peter wanted to see what was going to happen. And again, a million things could have been running through Peter's mind at this point. We'll never know. It doesn't matter. But Peter wanted to see what was going to happen. And it says, now the chief priests and the elders and all the council sought what kind of witness? They knew they didn't have anything. They knew they didn't have anything. They didn't seek true witness. They knew there wouldn't be any. They sought false witness. In other words, and this is the way, and it needs to be mentioned here, this is the way that all political systems wind up, regardless. This is the way our political system has been forever. Okay? Truth matters little. The truth is only an inconvenience when it's in the way. And the rest of the time, it's something to be manipulated and twisted for one's own goals. That's all truth is used for both sides. It's all just a muse at this point in time, regardless of which side of the aisle you sit on. Truth is just simply a tool that you only use when you need it, and the rest of the time a lie will work just fine. And this is their system. They sought false witness. They knew they didn't have anything true. This was all a setup, and this was all a sham. Okay? They had already discussed it, and again, you have to go all the way back. You can see through chapter after chapter as their plot is trying to get Jesus and to get him to this position. And in the beginning of chapter 26, they really sit down and say, all right, let's put the pieces together and figure out what it's actually going to take to get Jesus put to death. And this is the plot that they came up with. We're going to find And so in this trial, they want something. All they need is one thing to be able to say, all right, that's it. Let's put him to death. That's all they need. Okay? And he's fixing to give it to them. It says, Jesus held his peace, and the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. And they finally reveal what they're really trying to get at all along. Now this is important to note, because there's some people, there's a prominent Baptist pastor, used to be Baptist pastor in Atlanta, that talks about the fact that Jesus never played the God card. He never claimed to be God, never acted as though he was God. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Jesus didn't even try to hide the fact that he was the Christ, that he was the Messiah. He never tried to hide that. And so this is the part that they really didn't like anyway. Okay? And so he basically, after all of their attempts, after all of their failed tries with these false witnesses and everything that they're doing, he basically says straight to his face, he says, I adjure you, I beg you, I force you by the living God, tell us. He's saying, basically, you've either got to answer yes or no. And in something that no politician ever seems to be able to do, Jesus is going to answer either yes or no. He's forcing his hand here and saying, you either are or you are not the Son of God. Which one is it? Okay, and we don't understand the Old English and the way that the speech used to be, but it says, Jesus saith unto him, thou hast said. Now, we in our minds, we read that and we think, well, I don't know what he's really trying to say. In the Old English, this would be plainly understood as what Jesus is saying here is, it is as you have said. Meaning, Jesus is ultimately saying, yes. Yes. Am I the Christ, the Son of God? Yes, I am. And to back up what I'm saying there, he says, nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter, after this moment in time, shall ye see the Son of Man. And they knew this, everybody there knew this. The Son of Man was the name that Jesus always used for himself when he referred to himself. He said, you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Jesus said, yeah, I am. And ultimately for you, like everybody else, you will see me again. But you'll see me when I'm in power. You'll see me when I'm returning in the clouds of heaven. And ultimately for this man, for Caiaphas, you'll see me in judgment. That's ultimately what Jesus is saying. It's almost a turnaround, if you will, for what's going on. Right now, Caiaphas has all the power. He has everybody behind him, and he is acting as though he is sitting in judgment. And what Jesus is saying is, yeah, I'm the Son of God. And when you see me again, it's going to be turned completely around. I'm going to be sitting in power, and I'm going to be coming in the clouds of heaven, and the judgment will be on you and not on me. And that's what he's saying here. And it says, then the high priest rent his clothes. And this was symbolic for them. This was something they did. Saying, he hath spoken blasphemy. And ultimately, what they put Jesus to death for was for Jesus's, what they termed blasphemy, which was that regardless of what anybody thinks, the charge, it's why when Pilate wrote the charge over Jesus and put it on the cross, the placard or the piece of wood or whatever it was said, this is Jesus, King of the Jews. The ultimate charge was blasphemy for claiming to be God. That's why they put him to death. Now, I will 100% agree that it is absolute blasphemy to claim to be God. Unless you're God. and then it's not blasphemy. And so he rightly answers, yeah, I'm the Christ, I'm the Son of God, and it is not blasphemy, but for blasphemy they're going to put him to death. And the high priest here says, what further need have we of witnesses? Good for them. They couldn't use any of these witnesses that did them no good. He says, now you have heard his blasphemy. Basically he's saying, you've heard him say he's the Son of God. And again, he was, but they did not accept that. They did not want him as the Son of God, and that they answered and said he is guilty of death. Blasphemy in the Jewish system, blasphemy against God was punishable by death. Now, in their system, the punishment of death was carried out only one way. Does anybody know what that one was? In the Jewish system, death was always carried out by stoning. But Jesus wasn't stoned to death. Why not? Well, turns out, as much fun as they're having here putting the Son of God to death, they didn't really want it to be them that did it. Because after all, they knew they had a lot of people that followed Jesus and that thought highly of him as a prophet or whatever, but they knew that a lot of people had seen him do a lot of these things. So they really didn't want it to be the blood on their hands. So the plot thickens. Now, again, you can obviously see who's launched this whole conspiracy and this whole plan. It's them. They're the ones that are guilty of the death of Jesus. But the plot gets even deeper because they have decided that rather than them get their own hands dirty and look guilty of his death, let's pass this off to Rome and let them take care of our dirty work. That's ultimately why, and again, this would not have typically been the way that they would have done things. But it is why that the prophets foretold of the fact that he would be hung on a tree. That system of execution hadn't even been invented when those prophets spoke of that. And yet here we have Jesus going to wind up not being stoned to death, but on the Roman cross. And again, all of this was foretold and all of this was known by God from the very get-go. I'm hurrying. We're going to try to cover these last few verses. This starts to really get into where it gets real and it gets grotesque and it gets sad. What man is capable of. Again, Jesus only did good. He only helped. He only healed. But it says in verse 67, and this was their way of handling blasphemy. But it said, then did they spit in his face. And they buffeted him, meaning they hit him with a closed fist, one after another. And others smote him with the palms of their hands. So some people hit with an open hand. Either way, everybody takes a turn, slapping, punching, spitting on Jesus. Keep in mind, go back 10 verses, keep in mind Jesus has all the power in this situation. There is never a moment in time here. Remember this, because remember how we would be. Okay? There's never a moment in time during this whole entire process, all the way from here up until Jesus is hanging on the cross about to die. There's never a moment in time where Jesus can't just simply say, stop. That's enough. It's not worth it, and he never does that. He never does that. And the Bible later tells us it was because of us. Even though he despised the cross and despised the shame, it's because of us that he continued to press forward and to press onward. He was not doing this for his benefit. He is doing what he is doing for your and my benefit. Even as they spit in his face and as they hit him with their hands. And they're not only doing this, but they're doing it in the spirit of mockery, in the spirit of laughter. They're making fun of him. They're hitting him with their fist. And by this time, literally the swelling would be so bad that you couldn't even see, because they're saying, prophesy unto us, thou Christ. This is all very, very mean-spirited, and you can tell that they're having a good time with this. They're saying, basically to him, they're saying, look, you're the Christ, you tell us who just hit you. Now, he doesn't open his mouth and he doesn't say anything. Truth be told, he could have told them if he'd have wanted to. But he continues to let this whole scenario play out as though he has no power. And this is one of many, many places where we can demonstrate that really, really true power is about control, self-control, and not about losing self-control. People that truly have power and that truly are powerful know when to withhold. Okay, that's the truly power, as he withholds what he really could do. We now go back to Peter. As all of this is going on, Peter, we know, has followed him afar off and is now walked in to the palace and is gathered with the servants. Now, he's not in there with the priests and all of these that are doing this, but he's a little without with the rest of the servants, just watching what's going on. And he's seeing this, and he's watched now as Jesus is being beaten on and hit and spit in his face and all that's going on. And all of this is registering with Peter, because Peter is seeing what they're doing to Jesus. And it says that as he sat without in the palace, a damsel came to him saying, you were with him too. Thou also was with Jesus of Galilee. She's pointing him out, I think with the intention of alerting anybody around that would have the power, basically saying, you need to be in there with him because you're just as guilty. You were associated with him. And so, perceiving the danger in that and seeing what is happening to Jesus as he is watching, it says in verse 70, but he denied before them all, saying, I don't even know what you're talking about. He said, I don't know what you're saying. I know not what thou sayest. And so he kind of backs out of that situation, and in verse 71 it says, and when he was gone out into the porch. So now he's backed out, he's outside under the portico on the porch there. It says another maid saw him and said unto them that were there. She's pointing him out to everybody that's gathered around, and she says, hey, this fellow was also with Jesus of Nazareth. She's calling attention. I'm sure Peter is like, all right, quit pointing me out. You're calling. She's like, hey guys, this guy was with him too. And it says again he denied with an oath. He's basically saying here, I promised by whatever oath that they would speak in that day according to something. He says, I do not know the man. Hours earlier, Jesus said, you will deny me. And Peter says, I don't care if I have to deny, I won't deny you. And now Peter is standing there saying, I don't know him. I promise you by everything that is holy, I do not even know who this man is. Out and out denial and an out and out lie for Peter. And it says, and after a while came unto him, I gotta hurry, they stood by and said to Peter. Now I think the connotation here is that a larger and larger group is kind of gathering around Peter, and Peter is perceiving the danger more and more by the second as he's continuing to be identified. And it says, those that stood by said to Peter, surely thou art also one of them. They're saying, you gotta be one of them. He says, for thy speech bewrayeth, and we would use the word in modern English, betrayeth, meaning your speech is giving you away, Peter. Thy speech bewrayeth thee. And of course there's not time to stop here and say, But apparently there was something different about the way that Jesus spoke and the way that Jesus taught, because they said here that the way that Peter spoke and the way that Peter taught instantly gave him away that he had been with Jesus. And there's all kinds of tie-ins there that you could make with the fact that we as Christians should be able to be identified by the way that we talk and the way that we behave, that we're Christian. Our speech should betray the fact that we are the children of God. If somebody can't tell whether or not we're a Christian after spending vast amounts of time with us, there's probably an issue there. Okay? And they're saying your speech is giving you away. And then, in order to make sure that his denial was complete and believable, it says then, verse 74, began he to curse and to swear. He began to use their language. He began to talk like them. He began to use vile and profane language, to curse and to swear, saying, I know not the man. He's basically using, again, our modern form of cussing and swearing and saying that I don't know who this man is. He changes his speech to the point where he sounds like somebody that has not been with Jesus. And it says, and immediately, as the words fall out of Peter's mouth, I don't know him. I do not know the man. It says immediately the cock crew, and Peter remembered the words of Jesus, which said unto him, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and he wept bitterly. And of course, from the other Gospels in John, we know that not only did the cock crow and it reminded Peter, but we know that Jesus looked on Peter. Peter and Jesus apparently at some point made eye contact at that moment in time. And it all came flooding back for Peter, and Peter realized he told me exactly what I was going to do, and here I am. I have denied the Lord that I said I loved. And he went out and wept bitterly. Now, Judas also is going to go and weep. What is it that sets these two men apart? I wish I had more time, but we'll have to look at it next week as we continue what's going on. And of course, 27, we see as Jesus is on his way to the cross now. And we'll see the rest of the story play out there. So, all right, I'm done. Thank y'all for being here.